I want to consider this interview as insights into Lawrence Scott with, let's say, advice for aspiring writers. So at the end, I wouldn't be asking you for any parting words for any aspiring writers, right? Hopefully the
I
interview
will be doing
itself,
that.
yes, should do really well. Okay. So my first question is, what does writing do for you?
What does writing do for me? Right. Well, it gives me a chance, to explore a lot of myself and to explore the world around me. I notice you asked me to talk about history, for instance, and being a historical, that is a genre that I'm working, being a historical novelist. But I wouldn't consider myself as actually writing historical books. I think I write books that are inspired by history. And that is certainly a big thing. So I think one of the reasons I write is I want to say something about how things have been addressed in the past and how I feel they should be addressed. And instead of writing nonfiction, I want to write fiction because I want to use the imagination, I want to use invention to enter people, um, people unlike myself, maybe, or people like myself, but to enter in order to give a voice to people, which sometimes in kind of usual history, what we call history, you don't always have that. You have facts and figures and dates and places and so on. And often the person, the people are not their voices are not heard. And I think that's where the fiction writer actually adds to that. And right from the start, I think that's the thing that inspired me the most, was to address things in history. And I've continued doing that. Yeah, I think so.
Yes, that me, my background is in history and in
Right.
writing history and research. And I feel that I feel you right, but it is only for people who are involved in the area of history and research who would usually find your material or even find it interesting, but you do not reach the wider audience, the wider public, and and give them that human feel of history, move away from the dates, move away from.
Sorry, you're saying what you're saying, history doesn't do that, or that I don't do that?
No. I'm saying history in itself, like academic
Yes,
history. Yes, yeah,
yes, academic
yeah,
history.
yeah.
Mind you, I think some academic history can read in a very powerful way. For instance, I mean, if you take C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, for instance, I think that reads actually like a novel. I mean, I remember reading Black Jacobins, way back in the 70s. And yeah, I was driven to read like I would read a novel, actually, and the characters in it. But not all history is written that way. But still, yeah, I wouldn't want to make it that history is not interesting. I mean, historians can write very interestingly. And for instance, this present book of mine, Dangerous Freedom, I have acknowledgements to many historians um, in it whose history has excited me. But I still think that the fiction writer, to use a phrase which someone has used in regard to this new book of mine, fictive empathy, in order to enter in an
Yes.
empathetic way into people in history. Um, the fiction writer can do that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that too.
Yes,
That
I like it
definitely.
too. It comes from a British writer called Marina Warner, who incidentally has connections with Trinidad through her colonial family. And she's been at Bocas, actually. Um, and she, in her, I just have it here, just by chance, I have
Just by chance.
Dangerous Freedom here. And she says, Dangerous Freedom reveals how powerfully an act of fictive empathy can dispel long shadows of historical forgetfulness.
Um,
So I think, yes, I think the fiction writer can do things possibly or in ways in which the historian can't, because the historian has to stick to the facts and the figures and so on. Though, of course, great history, I think, is in the interpretation of facts and
mhm.
And so, yeah.
you know, but it allows for the imagination, you know,
Exactly.
and sometimes on our own, you know, and we're unable to give life to some historic stories. So I
Yes.
think historical fiction writer does that, right?
Yes.
Right, and you
Definitely
do
do
that.
that. Yes. I
Yeah,
try to do that. Yes.
we're known to do it well. I don't, next question. This one. When did you consider yourself a writer? When did you recognize that it was inevitable, that this was the path that you would take?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer from about when I was about 20, I suppose. But I didn't know a great deal about it, and I certainly hadn't read enough. And I think that's a really, really important thing about being a writer is that to read. Um, you were saying, well, whether I would give any advice to people about writing. I wouldn't give a lot. I don't have a lot of advice to give, but something I would say is you've got to read. Um, like if you were a potter, you wanted to throw a pot, you would look at good potters, how to do pottery. Or painters, you look at great painters. And I think I wanted to look at the best writing to be a writer. I think that's really, really important. Reading. Um, so I did start reading. I mean, I finished my education in Trinidad up to O level, and then I came to England to be a Benedictine monk. And it's actually in a Benedictine monastery, in its library, that I actually began to be inspired, not so much to go on with being a monk, but to perhaps become a writer. Um, and I remember one of the young monks saying to me, well, you must start with Jane Austen. And I did. And then I quickly discovered D.H. Lawrence, actually. I found that a bit much more exciting. But it was the reading, yeah. But it all simmered, and I used to write a lot of poetry and so on. So when did I think of myself as a writer? Well, it took a long time. I remember when I first met Earl Lovelace, who I'm sure you know, um, I was very lucky to meet him very early on when I returned to Trinidad in '77. And I was having a drink with him. And I said, I want to be a writer, I want to write. And he said, go ahead. He said, you know, a typical Earl Lovelace way, go ahead and write. And didn't really give me any advice. And I talked a lot about writing with him and heard him talk about his writing. And that was an enormous inspiration to be a writer. Um, I suppose, I mean, I was very excited when my first short story came out, in I think Trinidad and Tobago Review, which Tapia, I don't know whether you remember what Tapia was. Um, Unfortunately, because I had an epigraph to my short story, it was called The Pond. And the epigraph to the story was by Mervyn Morris, the Jamaican poet. And they published this, my story, my first story, as by Mervyn Morris. They made a mistake in the. So I had my first story published then, and I was very excited about that. But I don't think I considered myself a writer then. Well, my first novel came out. That was very exciting. Yeah, I had a lot of short stories coming out in newspapers and journals and so on before. Um, I call myself a writer, but it's not a big thing to kind of think I'm a writer. Um, but I suppose I have been. This is my fifth novel, so I've got about 7 books. Here, some of them here. I don't know if you can see any of them. Can you see any of these things on
No,
my
you have to
side?
get it
No, I can't bring them in.
Oh, okay.
Can you see them now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so these are my books. And that's
Impressive.
Dangerous Freedom, which has just come out.
Right.
Right.
This is
Yeah. And Witch Broom here, which was republished recently, had its anniversary of 25 years. So I'm very proud of that. And I was very proud of this book. This is Aelred Sin, which won a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Very proud of that. This is my book based on the life of Casabon, Michel Jean
okay.
Casabon.
Right.
Light Falling on Bamboo. Yeah, so Yeah, I'm a writer, I suppose. Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm a
Yeah,
Trinidad writer.
yeah, you touch some interesting topics.
Yeah.
Casabon, that's really
Yes, that was my last novel, Light Falling on Bamboo. And I had to I was at UTT actually doing a research project there, and that novel came out of that research and writing. And I have another book which I haven't got here actually, which is a non-fiction book, which I did at the same time, which was very important, which is called Our Voices, Our Lives, and it's based on people on Golconda, in Golconda, you know Golconda down south,
so yeah.
which was a sugarcane estate. I grew up on a sugarcane estate, right, near to Golconda.
Okay.
Um, and I wanted to work with people to tell their stories, people who had worked in the sugar. I wanted them to tell their stories. And I thought it was going to be, I got a creative writing class, but actually then it was difficult because actually some people were not literate to write, to be
Mm-hmm.
part of a creative writing class. So we recorded their stories. Myself and three teachers were on the project. So
Okay.
this was a UTT project. And that was fascinating because I was in the landscape where I grew up, the landscape, which is in a lot of my stories. Um, so that was a very proud thing for me to do, actually. I felt as a writer, though I edited it and wrote introductions and so on. But yeah, to work with people who, from where some of my stories come, or the landscape and some of their, yes, that whole sugar landscape around San Fernando is very important for me. Yeah.
Well, I'm
All that's
originally
been part of being a writer. Yes, yes. And I suppose I got to do that because I'd done other work. So that was useful. But I consider that a really exciting and a very important thing for me to have done. I learned a lot doing that. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I'm from South also, so I'm familiar with the Golconda area and
Where are you from in South?
Siparia.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
A bit further down, a
Sorry?
bit further south.
Yes, a bit
Yeah.
about 20 minutes
So
south.
you're what Siparia or Siparia? I used to
I'm in
see
Champlain. I'm in Champlain now.
now. Yeah. So you're near, kind of very interested in Siparia Mai and all of that. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, those are festivals that I grew up in and around.
La Divina
La
Pastora.
Divina Pastora. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I went
I'm
to the
interested
boys'
in all of
RC.
that. Yeah.
I went to school in the boys' RC, so and it's connected to the church. So we
You
would
went to
be
Boys RC in San Fernando,
no Siparia.
in Siparia. All right.
Yes, yeah. So you're connected to
And I went to Boys RC in San
the
Fernando.
San Fernando. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And I
Before I
remember the
then
Golconda.
went, and after that, I went up to Mount St. Benedict. Mount St. Benedict had a school then. I don't know whether you knew that.
No, no,
Yeah, in the 50s, 60s. Well, I was in the 50s and early 60s. Yeah, Mount St. Benedict had a school, a boarding school. I boarded, and then there were day boys as well who came from the Tunapuna area and so on. Yeah,
okay. Okay.
Champlain. Yeah.
It's interesting using the Golconda area, that area that you grew up in your writing. It's something that I also do with
Oh,
Siparia.
right. So what are you writing?
Actually, historical fiction.
Ah, right.
Yeah, I would usually write on history or art.
Right.
Right,
Oh,
those
well,
are
we're
the
doing
two
the
areas.
same thing then, because I've written on Casamore. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But reaching a wider audience,
Yes.
and being a bit more creative.
Right.
I think studying both art and history basically led me towards creative writing.
Right. Yeah. And that took me into writing my stories, first of all, a collection of stories called Ballad for the New World. And then, which was a big story I wrote called The House of Funerals, which was quite addressing part of Trinidad history. On my mother's side, I come from a French Creole family. So I was interested in that. I was learning a lot really about the history, which I had never learned actually when I was a boy. Um, so it was very, very exciting. So when I came back to England, I had all this, it was like I had notes and notebooks and things still to read. And I just settled down to writing. And then my first collection of stories came out and Witch Broom came out. Um, so that's how I came to start writing things inspired by history, I suppose. And you asked me at the beginning why I was writing, because I wanted to explore myself in that history, and I wanted to explore the history. So a great opportunity I got, in a sense, by, well, I think, yeah, Earl Lovelace has a lot to do with it. And other writers, I mean, right there in Port of Spain, I used to work in the theatre. Derek Wolcott would be coming in every year and putting on a play. It was a young Derek Wolcott before he won the Nobel and all of that.
Mhm.
All that was very, very exciting for me. I worked as a stage manager at the Little Carib Theatre. All of that was feeding in to me returning to Trinidad. Um, and because I wanted to write, earlier on, as I said, but I had started when I was a young man, still in the monastery, but my subject eluded me. I couldn't write about England. I didn't know it. I didn't know England in my soul, really. It was only when I returned to Trinidad I discovered what I really wanted to write about. I think gradually. And that's what I've remained writing about. Apart from this book, this new book is not set in Trinidad, nor has it got a memory of Trinidad, which my
Yeah.
other books have. But the central character, Dido Elizabeth Bell, as she's known in history,
Mhm.
or Elizabeth Davinier, as she is in my novel, her married name, is a woman from the New World. So the extended Caribbean. She's from Pensacola in Florida. That's where her father was, and so on. So I'm still linked with the New World, and I'm in. My stories are about that. That these histories, these colonial histories, are about here and there, and I'm moving all the time in that. So that's what brought about the writing of this book. So I consider it a Caribbean book. It's grown out of my Caribbeanness, if you like, my Caribbean consciousness. It's not an English book,
Yeah.
Englishman's book, if you
Yeah.
like. It's a Trinidadian fellow's book.
Something out of the diaspora.
Yeah,
Um,
that's the right word. Yeah.
yeah, so I
You
had
must
two other
you
questions.
must interrupt me, Al, because sometimes I could just I
No,
can go
this is very valuable.
on.
I will not. Yes. Um, but I had two other questions that you would have already answered with respect to, inserting the history. So I want to ask, what specific childhood experiences you think would have entered into your work? What sort of characters over time?
Childhood experiences. Right.
Yeah.
Well, in my short stories, a lot of my first collection of shorts, Ballad for the New World, I started off. I remember I was just talking to my wife today about I talked to you actually about a story called The Pond, my first story,
Mhm.
which is very much based on the landscape of Pittimorn Estate near Golconda, where my father was managing an estate there. And it was, it's a story about going to school in San Fernando and going out there to home. And I began to discover all the kind of contradictions. This is the 1950s in Trinidad, the 40s and 50s. It's a very different kind of world, particularly for a white boy growing up in Trinidad. So I had a lot of black friends in school. When I went home, I was in another kind of environment, if you like. Um, that changed for me in a big way, actually, when I went to Mount St. Benedict, because at first I was in the school itself, and a lot of white boys were in that school. And then I decided I would go to become a priest. I joined the seminary. And then all my friends from about 14, I suppose, between 14 and 19, were predominantly black friends. And that was a big experience because they came from all over the islands as well. They came from St. Vincent and Grenada and St. Lucia, all wanting young fellas going to school at Mount, but wanting to be priests. So that was a big experience, a change for me. And yeah, that has stayed with me all my life, really. Um, I've lost my way now. What just take me? It's
No,
been
but
childhood
yeah.
experiences. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, a book that was a very brave book for me to write was, I think, was Aelred's Sin, right? And it's a book about, what would I say now? It's a love story, really, but it's a love story. I, I want to say, some people would call it a gay novel. They would say it's a love story because it's between two men.
Mhm.
I don't call it a gay novel in that way, because I don't think the characters themselves knew what it was to be gay.
Okay.
There maybe is one character in there who knew he was gay. So it's a love story of young boys to start with and young men finding themselves in love, um, and discovering that. And it's a story that takes place in a doubly sort of difficult place, because it takes place inside of a monastery.
Okay.
Um, so how is that connected with childhood? Well, I think it's connected with childhood because I think Catholic childhoods, certainly in the 50s, um, I don't think priests and advisors knew what to do with boys who, I suppose, would say had crushes on each other.
Okay.
How to explain all that. And it was very often just explained as sin, um, and not explained psychologically. And I suppose I wanted to address that, um, for Trinidad. And Trinidad has just only now begun to actually open up its tolerance
And
and
explore.
understanding of that's in terms of its laws of sexuality. I think it has an understanding of a lot of people, and a lot of
Yeah.
it is being written now, and
Mhm.
that's very good. So I would say yes, that boyhood at Mount St. Benedict, and some of the difficulties for me and for other boys, not for having a language, not having a way to understand things, um, took me towards this novel. It's not my story in a sort of strictly autobiographical sense, but it's a story that I think addresses some of the things that I remember, as a boy. Um, I think another thing, of course, which is in my writing, is this thing of growing up as a white child in a Black society. That is something I take on. So many things to do with childhood were in not in explicit ways, in sort of confused ways in which one dealt with friends and dealt with the idea of race. One didn't use the word race. It was like, but it's how one stumbled through some of these experiences as
Yeah.
a child.
It's maneuvered.
Yeah, I wanted to explore those things. So in terms of childhood experiences, and those subjects, sexuality, race, have now become quite important sort of, um, themes, if you like. Yeah, call them themes, in concerns of all my fiction, in a way, in some way or another. Um, yeah, I would say sexuality and race and the politics of those things.
Yes.
Uh, not just yes, the politics of them. Yes, yeah. You
Yeah.
need to jump in. You need to jump
Yeah,
in.
it's I mean, the contemporary movements, I guess, that started at different times and
Yeah,
at different sizes too. So that
yeah.
novel addressing that in the 50s and 60s
Well,
is
the
just
novel wasn't written in the 50s. I mean, I only wrote
the
Arid
time
Sin.
period.
Yes, the time period.
Time period, yeah.
The book is written in this that the well in this novel, Arid has two time frames, because the story is being told in the 80s.
Okay.
There's a present, which is the 80s, and then it's looking back into the 60s and earlier, and the 50s.
Right.
Because it's somebody, which is kind of a pattern I use. It's somebody who is the brother. There are these two brothers, and one went off to become a monk, and the other one, and he dies, and the other monk gets to know that and goes to England to discover why did his brother die, and what was his brother's life, apart from being in
Okay.
the monastery, and then discovers it. And to me, that one of the things I'm doing, I think, coming back to your questions about history, is that one of the critics that wrote about this book said this, and I think it's very profound. It's about returning to a site, if you like, call it a place that has to be excavated.
Mhm.
And you return there in order to repair things and to redress things. And I think that's what happens with this brother who goes to England to discover his brother's life and reads his brother's journals and reads notebooks, and then the brother's life begins to emerge. And it's the same with my new book. Very, very nearby where I live here in London is the site of where my central characters lived.
Yes.
And that site, that house, the landscape of the house, is another place I go to excavate. I return to it now to try and redress some of that history, the sort of romanticized versions of history we can have of the past, to try and give another view of it, and to give the characters a voice. And my central character in Dangerous Freedom, Dido Bell, people know about her in little fragments, but
Yes.
you don't know her voice. She doesn't speak, and she speaks in this novel, so she gets a voice. Yeah.
Yes. So necessary. And that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask, if you consider yourself a revisionist or a romantic historian. And I see that you do both, because the art, I guess, is the romantic part of it, you know.
Right.
And
So you think when you say revisionist, you mean I'm going there to what I call
in
repairing?
representing, like what we discussed earlier on, where you said that there are aspects of history that you want to bring forward to the reader.
Yes.
Yeah, things that people don't know about
Yeah.
history. So sort of revising it and presenting the actual history, or the actual lived moments.
Yeah. And yes, definitely. I want to de-romanticize.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. Want that?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Which book or which story, published or unpublished, if it's a story, do you consider your greatest piece of fine art?
Oh my gosh, Al. That's a difficult question. All my books they're quite different from each other, you know. When I wrote Witch Broom, everybody who reviewed it and said, this is magic realism in the Caribbean, this is influenced by Gabriel Garcia Marquez,
Mhm.
which it was in part. But I didn't continue writing like that. Um, I then wrote Aelred Sin, which is a very different kind of book altogether. And then after that, I went and wrote Night Calypso, which is again, a story, set on Shaka Shakari.
Mhm.
And I returned to the history of the 1930s and during the Second World War. And again, that is to de-romanticize a number of things about history. So all the books are quite different. So what would be my what is the actual question? What do I consider
Greatest piece of fine art.
my greatest fine art? I don't know what I'd be able to actually put it like that. Aelred Sin is a book I'm very, very proud of, right? Because I think it was a very brave book to write. I got into quite a bit of little trouble with this book. But in Trinidad received the book, in 1998 very, very warmly,
Okay.
because they were going to put on, Trinidad was going through a period there of an equal opportunities bill
Yes.
and rights for gay people and things like that. So the book got quite a lot of attention, and for that reason, I think, in the newspapers and so on. But quite apart from that, and it got a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. So I was really pleased by that. At least it got some recognition, because it was a very hard book to write, and I think a very brave book in the context of Trinidad and the context of the Catholic Church, which still probably needs to address some of these things. So You see, that stands aside on one way. But then I've got them all here, so I'm going to pull them out. This is a new edition of Witch Room with Miss Sexy cover on it, um, which brought out by Papillon Press. And well, I love this book because it's my first book, you know, and all my enthusiasm for writing and so on went into this book. So I have to love this book always. They celebrated 25 years and Papillon made a new edition of it. So I love this book in every way.
Let's get a view of the cover.
Yeah.
Lift it.
So
Just
I haven't got the first edition here. No. Yeah. Because the central character is a hermaphrodite. Right?
Okay.
So we have this hermaphrodite character striding through the wonderful landscape of Trinidad. One of the narrators of the story. But I mean, Witch Broom, I've talked about Witch Broom quite a lot. But what I was saying to my wife this afternoon, the thing with this kind of interview with you is this a whole new generation of people, you know. I launched this book in Port of Spain in 1992, you know. How old were you in 92?
14.
Pardon?
14.
14, there you go, you see. I thought so, that you're from a very different generation. But then I'm a great lover of the short story, you know, and that's how I started writing. I thought short stories would be possible, other than novels. You know, I couldn't conceive of myself as writing a novel. So I love short stories. I haven't got my first collection here with me, but this collection, Leaving by Plane, Swimming Back Underwater, which Papillon Press also brought out. And I really like some of these stories. And one of the things that I like about it too is, what's his name? Derek Wolcott. Derek Wolcott used to read people's books, you know. You wouldn't think so, but he would read. He kept up with Caribbean writing. And I met him at a Bocas festival, and he just said, "Lawrence, I love this book." And a particular story called A Touch of Blue. He said, that story about your mother, you know. So I was like, I was a big man, you know, but I was still so humbled by that.
A Touch of Blue?
By that kind of thing that he said there. And then eventually Papillon Press went to him and he got something. So actually at the front of this new book, one of the praises we're giving for my writing, the publisher is giving, is a really accomplished writer, Derek Wolcott. So that is one of the biggest accolades I've ever had, was when Derek just said to me he loved the stories, you know, and because I've talked about Earl Lovelace a lot, but Derek Wolcott is there as well. Derek Wolcott, Earl Lovelace. I mean, lots of other Caribbean writers, but because when I first started writing, it's a tradition, you know. I consider myself as writing in a tradition of Caribbean writing, I think. So Wolcott and Lovelace were certainly there. So it was great. So I can't give you one of them, you know. And I love Night Calypso, because every time I don't think I've ever reread any of my books again.
Okay.
Right through, you know. But sometimes I would pick up this if a student was asking me a question or something, writing something, I would start reading this. And every time I start reading Night Calypso, I just want to carry on reading it. And I think, you know, the librarians and Alice people, they performed it as a play. It's called One Book, One Community. That kind of a thing they used to run for a while. And I wasn't there for it. I didn't know. And some friends wrote to me and said, "We've seen this play at Nallis." And the librarians. It wasn't any kind of big production, you know. It was just, they must have loved the story. And it is a story I really love. But it's difficult to choose. I love them all for different reasons. And Casabon I love because, like you, I love painting. And it gave me a chance to write about landscape and landscape painting. But also it's set in the 19th century, you know, against the whole emancipation things. I was able to return to history as well. So they're all different. They're all different. But this is the book I'm involved with now. This is the book.
All right, and I'm coming to that one. But
Right.
before, so you would not be able to put your finger on one that you loved it. But
No, no,
which
no. I do. I do. I love Witch Room. It's my first book. It's like
uh,
people, well, I don't know, but I should use that analogy. But maybe people love their first child in a very particular way.
yes.
I mean, I learned to write that way. I mean, it's a bold book, Witch Room. Bold.
Mhm.
Um, and some people who are not in Trinidad would say, it's a difficult book because it's very embedded in Trinidad culture and everything. But I love it. But Aelred, I mean, right now there's a young student at Liège University in Belgium who's writing about both of these. He's just written an article, actually, which is published in Canada on both of these. And he's tackling both these books now, 25 years later,
Later, yeah.
30 years.
Yeah. Well, they're all timeless.
I'm proud of that.
Mhm.
But I like them all. When Witch Broom has just been translated into French.
Okay.
Yeah. The A Night Calypso got translated into French as well, actually. Yeah. So I can't say one, Al. Can't say one. I think they're all different kind of books. I learned different things about writing by writing them. That's another thing about writing and advice and so. I learned to write by writing. It sounds a funny thing. I just learned to
Yeah.
write by writing. So I learned to write by writing and reading. Yeah, I think that's what I. Yeah.
And feedback.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. All kinds of feedback, not just necessarily in. I went to a creative writing class. I mean, I've taught creative writing classes, um, and I've taught literature in schools, all my life. But I did not learn to write from a creative writing class. I went to a creative writing class for about a year. I learned to write by writing and reading, and if you like, copying. I wouldn't say copying because it's not literally copying, but
Mhm.
allowing myself to be influenced by other writers. Yeah, I think so. I mean,
I believe it's the most organic way.
pardon?
I believe it's the most organic way to learn.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very organic.
Mhm.
Exactly. I think it's a kind of organic way. Yeah.
Okay. And on my first question was about, what writing does for you. And I just asked about which you think is the greatest piece of fine art. But in in all these books, which do you think has the greatest or contributes the most to society?
Well, I have to come back to Aelred,
Mhm.
because Aelred is dealing with human love in a way that it still gives large parts of the world difficulty.
Yes.
And homosexual love gives, in many, many countries, there's still an intolerance of that. And it's sad, really. And I think my book is a love story. Um, and really, I would really challenge anyone who is intolerant to read my story and not be moved by it, not be moved by the humanness of it, the humanity of it. Um, it's not a proselytizing book. It's not kind of, I
Yeah.
remember one of my brothers said to me, "You're not promoting homosexuality, are you?" And I said, novels don't, I don't think novels promote things in that way. It had a very different kind of cover. This is about the third edition, I think. Um, and another kind of cover. And they were all, my brother wasn't a great reader, but he could see the cover, and he was a
Okay.
bit scandalized by the cover, I think. So I think this does speak to society, but in an important way. My new book too, right now, this book should have been published last year, and we postponed it because of COVID, and it's coming out this year. And that was the main reason, really. Um, and a lot of things that have happened in America and here and elsewhere like the whole Black Lives Matter
Yes.
movement. These things, this book meets with that, right? Identity, um, yes, identity, race, you know, this, that. So this is an important book in terms of history and race, I think. Yeah. But again, I don't write it, I don't write in a sort of teaching way. You have to be moved. You're moved. I want people to be moved by the characters
Yeah.
and then changed by them,
Like
really.
inserting themselves.
Yeah. It's not like I'm teaching you have to, you have to, I
To
want you
do.
to be moved. I want you to be moved by my characters in here, Jean-Marc, who is brother Aelred, and his brother Robert, and their lives. I want you to be moved by Elizabeth de Vigny, this woman who is looking back. She's looking back on herself as Dido Bell. And I want to be moved by that. Yeah.
Yeah. The first area I studied was visual communications, graphic design. And one of the first thing we learned was the purpose for design and communication design was to create awareness and to modify behavior. But I feel literature does that more than anything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. That's how
Yes.
you enter other people's lives. This
Mhm.
thing about fictive empathies. Why do we read novels? Because it's to enter lives. I've just been reading a lot of James Baldwin, actually. That's what I've been reading
Okay.
recently. Another Country and Shivani's Room. And my wife has just started reading Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I want to read that. And there's a lot about Baldwin around at the moment. I mean, he was an extraordinary writer for his
Okay.
time, really, to do with race and sexuality,
Mhm.
because he himself was homosexual
Yes.
and black. So when he was black, yeah. And both those things, he found both those things difficult in America, race and sexuality, and left, went to Paris and then to Nice. I've been going to, we've said before COVID, I've been going to Nice um, for Christmas time. And twice now I've made pilgrimages to Baldwin's house. Great writer, wonderful person. And apparently now the house has been destroyed. The French government or whoever.
Mhm.
So we haven't got, but I will still go back there on some kind of pilgrimage to Baldwin. Yeah.
Yes. And a lot of his work and interviews have recently
Yeah.
been in media,
Yeah.
you know.
And the film said, I'm Not Your Negro.
Well,
You know his work?
haven't been fully introduced to him. I'm seeing a lot of shorts, but I haven't read from him as
Oh,
yet.
you must read. You must
Yeah,
read. But you
yeah,
have a lot to look forward to. I mean, it's
yeah.
absolutely rich writing. I mean, I learned, for instance, this new edition of Another Country that's come out. There's an introduction by the Irish writer Colm Tobin, who I also admire, and he connects Baldwin with Henry James. I mean, 19th century writer. I never thought of Baldwin and James, Henry James. And I've just been reading quite a bit of Henry James um, for the first
Look,
time. Quite a difficult writer, actually. Um, no, he's a wonderful writer, Baldwin. If you got a lot to look forward to. Yeah, definitely.
yes, yes. I would say this even here that I'm a recent convert because most of what I've read throughout my entire life would have just been history and
Yes, yes.
those are the two
Of course,
areas.
Baldwin wrote a lot of essays, and he's known
Right.
for his non-fiction writing as well. I've read some of that. In fact, that's what I've read mostly. Because Giovanni's Room and Another Country, I read Giovanni's Room in the 60s. It came out in 63, and I read not very long after, about 68. Um, and then Another Country came out, I think, a bit later, maybe the early 70s. Yeah, so I mean, these are books from long ago.
Okay.
You weren't even born. A boy of 14 in 92.
92, yes. And I marked that by visiting Shaka Shikari
Right. Well, you
uh,
should. Then you have to read Night Calypso when you go back to Shaka
yes,
Shakari.
yes, and I felt I had to bring that up because I would have gone there in '92, and I guess this was before it was that party spot,
Yes. Yes.
and it looked like something out of a, a, a horror movie or a dystopian movie because the buildings were still there and very present, but just
Yes.
all overgrown. Some of the
Yes.
streets that lined the coastline was still there, and some broken off, parts broken off into the water, light poles. So it looked like, the giant came down and
Yes.
drive down the tongue people.
Yes.
It was, and in the monastery, there was still lots of books on the shelves. This is '92,
Really.
lots of
Yeah.
books on the shelves there. So
That was in '92. Yeah.
yeah, 1992.
See, it wasn't until about the 2000s that I went there. Actually, that's when I was researching this book. Yeah.
Okay.
But there was still this sense of the kind of ruination that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Very exciting to see that, actually. Again, you see another kind of site to excavate.
Yeah.
And I remember finding a little vial of one of the treatments they used for
Okay.
leprosy. Actually, and
Mhm.
I still have it actually on my mantelpiece in my study, like a little memory of my research. I didn't find books, but there was a lot of um, I don't know, medical reports and things scattered
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. It was. I can't say for sure what when they would have abandoned the island, but to go there in '92 at 14 and see rooms that seemed somewhat intact. I mean, there was no real
Yes,
furniture, but there were books on shelves. There were I guess the Coast Guard would have used the area to practice their shooting. So there are a lot of shells.
yes, you saw that in the convent. Actually, they had these kind of
Yes. Yeah.
figures up on the wall. You probably saw those as well, which they used for
Target
practice
practice.
shooting
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah.
The
So.
opening of this book, actually, the opening of this book, I won't read it to you now, but the opening of this book has a lot to do with what you discovered and
Mhm.
I discovered on arriving at Shaka Shakari. In the book, the island is called El Caracol, because that was a name that Columbus gave it, apparently. So
Okay.
I used that name for the book.
What does that mean?
I think it means it's kind of a shell. I
Okay.
think like a conch, I think.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I know there were some large conchs that were used by for food by the
Yeah.
natives.
Yes,
Yeah. And
yes.
they're extinct now. I
Yeah.
guess.
Well,
Mhm.
yeah. But there's the kind of river conchs you can still get. When I used
Mhm.
to go up to Earl Lovelace's house in Matura, his wife used to cook curried conch and so on, from the river.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I've never never
Yeah,
had
you never had it.
the
I was lucky to have it. Yeah.
yeah. Closest thing I think is lambi in Tobago.
Oh yes, lambi. And
Yeah.
lambi in Grenada as
I
well.
was I was years ago when I used to eat
Yeah,
meat.
lambi. Yes,
Hey, okay, well, to your new book,
yes.
yes. What can you tell us about this book that you think sets it apart from similar narratives?
Similar narratives, right. Well, it hasn't been a novel about this period of history that I know of
Mhm.
in quite the same way, using these characters, using the character of Dido Elizabeth Bell. But there's a film. I don't know whether you've ever seen it called Bell.
I didn't see it. I have a copy, but I
Right.
didn't look at it. Yeah.
Okay. So, that's a very good film. It's beautifully made,
Mhm.
quite moving, and so on. But that's quite a different story of mine. Okay, so actually, there's one thing I was going to mention, Al, and I kind of mention it here. It's not like part of the interview. So anyway, you're going to edit this interview. There's a promotional film which has been made, um, 6 minutes actually,
Okay.
which I'm going to use at the launch of did you get an invitation to the Zoom launch?
Yes, yes, I got that last week.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. So it's going to be done there, but it's being used by the publishers, and it's been done at Kenwood House, which is this great house, and Kenwood Park, which is a big park here in London, in North London, about 20 minutes from where I live. And that promotional film is a Vimeo. You can find it online.
Mhm.
And I was going to say, I don't know whether that would be a nice thing for you to use actually for the Literature Week.
Oh, yeah, well, we
So you can go and
gladly,
have a look at it, because
yeah,
it actually brings together all the kind of essential things that Trinidadians might not know about in,
okay.
in the background to this book. Because if in North London, well, to a lot of people in North London, if I said Kenwood House and Dido Bell, people would immediately make the connection.
Yes.
They would know what Kenwood House looked like and the landscape and so on. And that might be new to Trinidad,
Definitely.
unless you went online and discovered it all, and you could
Did
easily.
some research on it, particularly.
Yes. So that's something worth looking for. So it was made by a little group, not a company called Repos Films, which is a Trinidadian filmmaker called Karen Martinez, and her husband Andy Lambert, who he's a British filmmaker. So this is a short film, and it brings out the essentials to the background of Dangerous Freedom. So, and what I'll just say to you is, we have this history of this young woman, Dido Elizabeth Bell, who is the daughter um, of an African woman who was enslaved and an English naval officer in the 18th century. And in 1761 or so, he brings his daughter and his mistress, you would want to call her, African woman, called Maria Bell, to England. And the child, Dido, is their child, and he puts the child to live with his uncle at Kenwood House. And his uncle is Lord Mansfield, and Lord Mansfield's wife, Lady Mansfield. And Lord Mansfield is the Chief Justice of England. He was the Chief Justice for 32 years.
Okay.
So Dido Elizabeth Bell lives with them as a mixed race girl. And then another girl comes to live with them, and she's called Elizabeth as well, Elizabeth Murray. That was her father. Now she is an orphan, and she's put with the Mansfields. The Mansfields don't have children.
Okay.
And they take these two children and they grow up as companions. And what you can also research is there's a very famous portrait. And as you're into painting, you must go and look at it. It's in the film as well. So the very famous 18th century portrait of Dido Bell, seen as a black woman, because she's mixed race, but she looks like a black woman, and Elizabeth Murray, a white woman, side by side. And when you look at it, you'll see what an intriguing portrait it is. Because most portraiture in the 18th century were usually of young slave children or
Yes.
servants
Mhm.
looking up in a very sort of beseeching, fawning sort of way to their white masters or mistresses.
Yes.
Now, this portrait of Dido and Elizabeth is very different. Dido is looking out. She's very exotically dressed. She's not dressed like Elizabeth Murray. So the portrait in itself is a very interesting thing, which I got into looking at. So that's the situation of Dido in her childhood and her young girlhood, growing up at Kenwood House with the Lord Chief Justice of England and his wife, and Elizabeth Murray. And my story, the story of the film, Belle, starts there. It takes on that part of the whole story. Where I start my story is Dido Bell has left Kenwood House and she's living in another part of London. She's living in Ranelagh Street down near Pimlico, so central London. But it wasn't central London then, but central London now is near Victoria Station, which is very central. And she's living there. She's now Elizabeth Davinier. She's married to John Davinier, and she has 3 children. And she's living in that. And she's now writing her own kind of memoir, if you like. And she's looking back on her early childhood in Florida, and then she's looking back on her growing up at Kenwood House. So the first time, in a way, Dido Bell gets a voice to say how she saw the whole growing up at Kenwood and growing up in Pensacola. Because the general story, and the story of, like you see it in the film, and you're generally told, for some people, she's called the Black aristocrat. Well, she wasn't a Black aristocrat. It was a very conflicted story because she was neither family nor was she servant. She was illegitimate and she was Black or mixed race. So it was so that's one of the things that drew me to this story, is the conflicted nature of the whole situation, right? Because this man, Lord Mansfield, he's chief judge in England, and he's judging the big slave trade case of the Zong. He's judging other cases of people being captured and sent back to the Caribbean or to North America. This James Somerset case, which is all tackled in the book as well. So the story hasn't been told the way I'm telling it. It's been told in a romantic way before, by film and art and history. Because a lot of historians also kind of slightly romanticize the story, but there are other historians who don't. And I drew on those historians. And because people have also, as well as romanticizing Dido Bell, they have romanticized Lord Mansfield and have him as a kind of leader of the abolition movement, for instance, or emancipation. And he was not. He was a liberal man, but he didn't do anything to reform, like the slave trade, for instance.
So there is some revision in
Yes.
your
So
writing.
the slave trade was going on right through the life of Dido Bell. So Mansfield didn't change any of that. But he wasn't a monster. He wasn't a terrible person. And that is the kind of contradictions of the age. You know, we have the age of enlightenment, and yet all the major powers of Europe are running the slave trade.
Yes.
Liberty is on everybody's tongue, you know, liberty. And it's no, you know, how could liberty, you know, the whole French Revolution, you had American Revolution, the French Revolution, and eventually the Haitian Revolution. But at the same time, the slave trade is going on right up to 1807, is it? And then enslavement going on to 1834. You know, so it's interesting that. And there's something I have at the front of this book. I used it as an epigraph. I'm very fond of epigraphs. And one of the epigraphs of Light Falling on Bamboo, the book about Casabon, which is set in after emancipation, is a quote from Lovelace's Salt. But now they had another problem. It was not how to keep people in captivity. It was how to set people at liberty. And I think that is incredibly kind of, you know, the colonial powers. How are you going to now set all these people at liberty?
Yeah.
You know, people were taking their liberty as well, of course. But that whole thing, and this book addresses itself to that as well, I think. So it's about enslavement, it's about liberty, how you get your liberty, and it's called Dangerous Liberty, Dangerous Freedom, because that freedom, though, like for her, though you have it, in this story, she is obsessed about the freedom of her children and obsessed with the recapture of her children.
Okay.
The capture of her children, rather, not recapture. Given the sort of, if you like, as I read it, the sort of trauma of her own life, her childhood. You know, she grew up till the age of 5, she was experiencing on her father's ship in the Caribbean, seeing people bought on auction blocks and enslaved and dressed in manacles and chains, this sort of thing. I don't write I don't write that kind of history as a horror. I write it much more sort of implicit.
Yes. Okay.
That it's there, but it's through her childhood eyes and through her mother. And her mother is an interesting figure in this, Maria Bell, because we didn't know a lot about her for quite a long time. And now we do know something about her. And I've drawn on that she lived here in England for quite a while. So Dido knew her until about the age of 13, not the age of 5, as some people thought.
Okay.
And so her mother was very significant. But the book, central to this book, is why she has lost touch with her mother, why she lost touch with her mother, and why was she not hearing from her mother, who was to write to her, because her mother returns to Florida.
So is all this information somewhat easy to come by, or?
Well, some of it is, yes, some of it is in. There's one particular book which I'll give you a kind of a history of this book called Bell as well, Paula Byrne's novel, not novel, history. But there's fragments of history.
Yes.
And again, I use my image of excavation. You see, I go to the site and you see excavation and how you use these bits and pieces to give flesh and blood, if you like, to the character. Yeah. So those are some things about it. So it's a book here. It's a married woman. She's Elizabeth de Vigny, and she's looking back on her life. And she wants to know, where is her mother, Maria Bell? Conveniently, histories till recently have been saying, oh, her mother died, and then her mother died.
Yeah, conveniently.
She's just sort of tucked away there. And that's one of the things I'm redressing, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
As we're on that topic, there was a question that just slipped my mind about that.
You should interrupt me more.
Yeah. Okay, but what about future plans for writing other areas of in similar novels, similar stories?
Right.
Have anything planned?
Well, for a while, so this, as I say, this book was to come out last year. It was all ready, to come out. So you go back, my books usually take around 4 years to write. Then maybe another year before it gets published. So you're going back 5 years, right, with this book. And I write a lot of poetry, and I've had only a little bit of it published. I haven't dedicated myself to poetry in the same way as I have to prose writing. But I'm hoping that a book of poems will come out this year, or maybe early next year. Papillon Press are interested to bring out a collection. And those were poems I wrote when I was writing Light Falling on Bamboo. Because one of the things that my wife and I did when we were writing this book is to go to all the different sites we knew that Casaubon had painted, and to see what they looked like in kind of modern, contemporary time. And a lot of sort of, they're sonnets. It's a collection of sonnets, a sequence of sonnets, and were about emerged from visiting these different sites. Yeah. So that's a collection of, that's what's probably going to come out next of my books. I mean, lockdown this year has been quite sort of special year for me, because this book was waiting to come out, and now it's coming out. And I also, towards the end of 2009, I developed prostate cancer. So I had cancer this last year, and so I'm all well now, actually, which is very good news.
Well, that's good.
Just had my kind of, I have to be monitored every 6 months, but I'm pretty well.
That's good.
That was a big thing. So I couldn't write, actually, for quite a while. Not that I was terribly ill or anything. I mean, I was dealing with everything, my treatments, but I was distracted, I suppose.
Yeah.
When you get an illness like that, I'm already old,
Yeah.
And then
But
my
your focus is on,
mortality is sort of comes into focus, you know.
I guess. Yeah.
So I was just trying, but I've actually started another novel. And so I'm returning to Trinidad. And I'm returning, well, certainly with one character. Yeah, I'm not going to say too much about it. No, I won't
Okay.
say much about it.
Mhm.
Because it's not, I haven't got very far with it. And so it might never get written. But I'd like it to be, I'm interested in it. I'm beginning to see what it's about.
Let's hope it does. One
So,
more
yeah,
question on the book. How soon will this be available in Trinidad and Tobago?
Nature's Freedom.
Yes, Dangerous Freedom.
So I've learned from the publishers that that wonderful bookshop in Port of Spain, paper-based at the Normandy,
Yes, normally.
Joan Deal, who's a friend of mine and a great support of my writing ever since I wrote it. Well, ever since Aelred Sin. Joan was at the launch of Aelred Sin. And another bookseller, Ken Jaikaran Singh, who used to run a thing called Lexicon Limited. He was a great, you know, writers need people who sell books, you know, and
Yes.
import books and so on. Ken Jaikaran Singh and Joan Deal. So Joan is importing this. She will have Dangerous Freedom. I think it'll be around for Bocas.
Okay. Yes,
I'm
which is
supposed to be doing an interview at Bocas with another Trinidad writer who lives in the States. Her first name is Lauren. I've forgotten her surname for a moment. She's a new writer, and she's also written a history, actually.
okay.
If you want, I can email it to you.
Yes, I'd appreciate that.
So I'm going to be doing a double session, kind of session with her and someone at Bocas about history and fiction.
Yes, well, it's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Right. I'm looking forward to seeing the book and catching up on some of these authors that you've mentioned, some of these publications, including your pieces.
Thank you very much.
Okay. It was
Okay.
wonderful and
Thanks a
have a
lot.
good one.
Good to you.
Okay.